students, right? 1 in 15 kids are exposed to domestic violence. And that's a very scary statistic. 90% of those children that are exposed are eyewitnesses.
Welcome to Crime News Insider. This is Jorge Del Portillo, and with me, as always, is Lori Hoff. How are you doing, Lori?
Hi, Jorge. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. We are recording this on October 13th, 2022, and it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And obviously, domestic violence is something that's unfortunately always in the news. Recently, Harris County, Texas reported that 35% of its homicides in its county were related to domestic violence. Atlanta had similar statistics. And obviously, we saw in the news recently several instances of domestic violence. If you just Google it in the news, there's a domestic violence incident recently in McGregor, Texas, where 5 people were shot dead in a suspected domestic violence rampage. And then in San Bernardino, a suspect was on the run after killing the mother of his child. And he ran and abducted his 15-year-old child, who unfortunately was caught, it seems, in a crossfire when he began shooting at the police. And October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we wanted to discuss this topic today because it's a crime that really affects all parts of society and sadly can result in some of the most violent crimes that we see and then that the community sees. So with us today is Ben Barlow. Benjamin Barlow began his career as a prosecutor in the San Diego County District Attorney's Office in 2010. He has spent the majority of his career in the Sex Crimes Division and the Family Protection Division. And he is also our association board president. He was first elected to our board in 2014 and then reelected since then and was elected vice president in 2018 and elected as our board president in 2020 and just reelected. Is that right?
I think that is right.
Did I get that
2014,
right?
you've been punishing yourself for a long time on the board.
It's every year has been better than the last. No, it's been a great experience and a great group of people to work with. So honored to do it.
Well, welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit, this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Can you tell us a little bit about the history and what it means to have this month dedicated to awareness of domestic violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And first and foremost, a pleasure to be with both of you. I always enjoy listening to the podcast and the amazing guests that you have, and hopefully I will try not to disappoint in following suit. But no, I appreciate the both of you talking about this issue and talking about Domestic Violence Awareness Month and domestic violence as a whole, because it is such a serious and substantial problem, an escalating problem, not only in our county, in San Diego County, but in California. And as you mentioned, I think, Jorge, in some of the statistics that you were talking about, nationwide, we're really seeing a significant increase in domestic violence. And so obviously, whatever awareness that we can bring to this issue for victims and survivors of domestic violence is great. So I appreciate you taking on this topic. As far as, what it is and what's the purpose of Domestic Violence Awareness Month or National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, really began in the late 80s. I think it was officially declared National Domestic Violence Awareness Month in 1989. And since then, it's really been an opportunity each October for us to acknowledge domestic violence survivors and to provide a voice for victims. It's an opportunity to bring the issue to the forefront, like the two of you are doing today and the podcast is doing, and really advocate for, or to continue to advocate for changes where we can in the law, in services that we're able to provide for survivors, to celebrate survivors who have made it through their cycle or made it through domestic violence trauma. More in those, obviously, that tragically did not and who have lost their lives to domestic violence. And there's far, far too many of those that are continuing to occur. It's obviously a deep-rooted issue that affects our community, affects our family members, it affects our coworkers, it affects everyone. I think some of the most recent statistics show that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by their intimate partner. So if you just think about that in context, you look around your office or your family gathering or your friendship group, the likelihood is that someone that whether you know it or not, has been impacted by intimate partner abuse in some capacity, whether it's physical abuse or psychological abuse, mental abuse, financial abuse. It really comes in a multitude of different forms. But the prevalence of it, as we're seeing as domestic violence prosecutors more and more, and picking juries, when we talk to potential jurors and we see those hands get raised of people who have been impacted by domestic violence, just in my career, I've seen that number just explode as far as the people from all ages, young, college kids who've grown up in homes of domestic violence to older individuals who've experienced it their whole life. So it is a major issue, and something that obviously Domestic Violence Awareness Month is hopefully shining a light on the issue, what we can do about the issue, and the services that we can provide to survivors of it.
One of the things that that our office has done and that you've been involved with, Ben, is a new place, a new location, but a new way of looking at how we approach domestic violence. And that's One Safe Place. For those of our listeners who don't know about this, can you explain what it is and what the concept is?
Yeah. So obviously One Safe Place is a new setup, really a facility. It's really so much more than that. It's a 40,000 square foot facility here in North County, San Diego. It's really one of the first, I think, of its kind. And that's in large part to the leadership of our district attorney, Summer Steffen, and a lot of the stakeholders here in San Diego County that have really wanted to provide a sort of one-stop shop for anyone affected or any family members affected by domestic violence, child or elder abuse. So it really deals with domestic violence, child sexual abuse, any sexual assault abuse as well, human trafficking, hate crimes, etc. Prior to One Safe Place opening, when I or my colleagues would work, or victim advocates who we have in our office would work with domestic violence victims, there was a number of different services or areas where we might say, well, there's this organization in the city of Oceanside. There's this organization in San Diego. There's this organization in Carlsbad or Escondido. And obviously San Diego County being as large as it is and made up of so many different cities, as a victim navigating that, you can imagine the difficulty of not really knowing where to go, who to contact. So it just added the strain and difficulty on those victims to navigate how to obtain these critical services that they need. One Safe Place is really a hub, if you will, of all of those groups coming together and providing those services under one roof. So if you're a victim of domestic violence, you can literally show up there. It's open on the weekends. It's open late at night. And those stakeholders, those service providers are all there, regardless of what you may need, from therapy to living assistance to just assistance with your children. Anything that you can think of, really, those services are there for them and to help them sort of navigate that process.
I think that's so revolutionary because, we're talking about stopping cycles of violence. You can imagine how difficult it is or how many gaps occur in that process of, gosh, I can't make this happen because X, Y, and Z, or all the barriers that are, involved in this, or income barriers, et cetera, to stopping this cycle of violence. And then you have a place where, all the resources are there. So you don't have to, those gaps aren't as large as they used to be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the gaps. That's a great way to describe it, because previously there were a lot of gaps. And it was really frustrating, even as a prosecutor, and I think for our law enforcement partners, to see how those gaps are impacting victims from getting the services that they need. And ultimately, it's not only just getting them out of harm's way, which I think, Lori, as you mentioned, is sort of getting them out of that cycle of violence, but it's really providing a place of healing and hope for them, that there is life beyond this relationship of abuse, out of this environment of violence, that there's people that want to help, that can help. And so to give them sort of hope of looking at a future without that abusive partner, without that abusive relationship is just as integral as getting them immediately into a safe situation. So,
oh, wow. Domestic violence is one of those crimes that it stands apart. If you get robbed, at a particular ATM, okay, you're reminded of that trauma that you suffered when you go to the bank. Or if you're a victim of a DUI accident, you might have this fear of driving. When you're a domestic violence victim, you are scared to be in your own home. Your abuser might be your own intimate partner, like you were saying.
I think what one of the biggest priorities for us as prosecutors is immediately getting some space between them and their abuser, right? Getting them some time away from that abuser so that they can begin to see what they can understand and get out of that cycle, because it's a cycle that goes round and round. And the only way, really, and one of the best ways to protect victims and to help them break that cycle, is to get them away from that abuser even if it's a short period of time. And so again, we know that the best way to do that is to get services, to them as quickly as possible, to let them know what their options are as quickly as possible. And even while we've seen sometimes victims might be hesitant at first to want to accept or trust those services, once they engage those service providers, then that in and of itself begins the process of getting them out of that cycle. And even if it's for, that's why protective orders, criminal restraining orders, temporary restraining orders even are so vital at the beginning point of this, because that space and that distance is critical so that they can go out and seek those services and let those service providers do what they're so great at doing, which is helping them navigate that trauma.
Let's talk about the cases themselves, because that's the bread and butter of what you do. What our prosecutors do is prosecute these cases. So what are the challenges that you face when you're prosecuting domestic violence cases?
That is the bread and butter of what we do. And I think more and more as domestic violence prosecutors, it's becoming more and more about sort of what we can also do and how we can also provide services to the victims outside of just, being in the courtroom. But I think, personally, for me, and what I try to tell a lot of my colleagues is it's understanding the challenges that are just naturally a part of these cases. I think, Jorge, you mentioned, if you're a victim of a crime, it's a traumatic experience regardless.
Right.
But it's so much more personal when it's happening in your home with someone who you may have children with. It's someone who you come home from work every day and they're in your space, in your home.
Someone who you probably love too. You have feelings for and you care for. That complicates things in a big, big way. Absolutely. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is what we know, and the difficulty for a victim to just, number one, report this, right? To number one, even get on the phone with the 911 operator or to go to a law enforcement officer and say, this person that I love, that I have children with, that I've been together with for whether it be 6 months or 25 years, is abusing. That first step is so difficult. Understanding that first step is difficult, but then understanding how difficult it's going to be on those victims to go through the criminal justice system, to have to testify against their perpetrator or the person that's responsible for their abuse. And then again, I think a part of our job as prosecutors is understanding that, if they have children together, if they have a marriage, that person's going to be in their life long after we're gone as prosecutors, long after, the district attorney's office is no longer involved in their relationship, or a judge, or whatever it may be, a victim advocate. So what can we do to try to set that person up or help that person get out of this cycle of violence, to recognize that is not how they need to be, how they should be treated. It's not right that they're being treated that way. They deserve to live a life free of that fear, that intimidation, and that violence. And so prosecution is one critical part of that, because I think we play a significant role in helping that person break that cycle of violence that we talked about, but also in many cases get the justice that they deserve when they have been the victims of abuse, especially for victims of domestic violence homicide, for their family members to know that person is going to be held accountable. So I think as prosecutors, we play a really critical role, but it's very different than maybe the role that we play as prosecutors in so many other different types of cases where it's just about holding the person accountable and getting justice for the victim. It's so much more layered than that, because again, we hopefully have to take a long view of where that victim's going to be 5, 10 years, 15 years down the road, and recognizing that person, we may not be able to keep them out of their lives forever. And so what can we do to help them right now?
And you say they might be re-enter in their lives before you go to trial. And I imagine when you're going to trial on in some of these cases, the victims have a change of heart and they recant their story. I'm sure you've seen that 1 or 2 times.
Yes, we see that. And I think, I think what's great about I think the kind of going back to what I was saying, which I think is critically important as prosecutors, is the understanding that.
Right.
And I think as domestic violence prosecutors, there can be a tendency as prosecutors who want to attain justice for our victims and want to hold people accountable, to be frustrated by things that are maybe causing us challenges in our trials and our cases, because we want to make sure that those people are held accountable under the law. But as domestic violence prosecutors, you have to understand that exact dynamic, Jorge, that the cycle of violence, a big part of that takes into account this sort of honeymoon phase or aftermath phase of the violence, where the perpetrator is apologizing and saying they're sorry, and really, getting the victim to believe that this won't ever happen again, even though we know it likely will. So by the time we get to trial over the course of a criminal prosecution, yes, we have to understand and expect that person may have a real hard time testifying, may want to recant, may want to not participate in the prosecution. But I think as prosecutors, the important part is understanding why, knowing and understanding why that is, and not being frustrated by that, but understanding that that's part of the problem. And that's why you're doing what you're doing, is to help that person hopefully in that cycle permanently.
You're looking at things holistically. I think you have to, if you're doing DV prosecution. You're right. It's not a one track. It is a holistic, sometimes a family affair. And one of the things that, correct me if I'm wrong, we saw an increase in during COVID was homicides, particularly DV homicides. And we all know that, things like domestic violence occur behind closed doors anyway. So when you have closed doors for a long period of time, under the stress of COVID, under the stress of losing jobs, under the stress of, being together 100% of the time, we just saw a spike in it. And one of the things that you're doing and our prosecutors are doing is going back and looking at red flags to say, how can we prevent this, the worst of the worst, which is the loss of a human life, a DV crime that ends up with a person dead. We can't take that back. We can't go back and, try to fix it. But what do we do way before that happens? And what are you finding?
Yeah, and I think what you're describing, Lori, is in that the tension building phase of that cycle of violence, which then leads to sort of an acute explosion of violence, which can be homicide or can be, very violent and tends to be. So every domestic violence homicide, we in essence do a debrief, or sort of a, as stakeholders from law enforcement to all different sort of, even child welfare services sometimes, of where could we have seen this coming? How can we have stopped this ahead of time, right? Oftentimes we're going to see a tension building or a ramp up of that sort of escalating conduct. But that escalation, that violence, which ultimately could peak at a very violent event, even a homicide, is what we want to try to get in front of the best we can. So the red flags are, any violence that comes in, any even misdemeanor level domestic violence, which may not seem on just, as it is, the conduct may not seem so serious to rise to a felony level, or to rise to an issue where we feel like, well, this person could be subjected to violence someday. It's important to intervene at that early age, or at that early stage. And so that's one of the goals of the Domestic Violence Recovery Program, which is a 52-week class that is mandated for all first-time domestic violence offenders. The point of that early intervention with the Domestic Violence Recovery Program is that it's sort of our first opportunity to make sure that this person gets off of that track, the perpetrator, the defendant, gets off of that track of learning how to deal with that escalating tension in a way that's nonviolent. So we don't see them down the road on a felony case, a more subjective, more serious violence.
I wanted to talk about sort of another aspect of it. We talked about Domestic Violence Month, or we're recognizing survivors and victims. And I'm just wondering if we don't put enough thought or effort into, maybe it's the prosecutor in me, but our abusers are, we have a lot of public information out there for victims, and so much of it is on victims to do something. And if they don't, then it's sort of their fault, right? If they don't take it upon themselves, if they don't do this, if they don't do that, then we sort of as a society are like, well, you should have. Don't we look at that and say, gosh, easy for me as a woman to say, well, I would leave, and we have to sort of talk to jurors about that feeling of, that may be what you think you would do, but that's not what often happens. And that's not the cycle. But man, abuse is learned. So we have abusers who have learned either because they've seen it in their own families, or they've seen it growing up, or that's what they were exposed to. And now they are doing it to their own families, to their own wives and children, assuming it's men. We know that that's not always the case, but But man, where are we going wrong in our society that it's all on these victims to make the right choice? Am I saying something totally inappropriate?
No, it makes sense. Why why aren't we intervening in these abusers and educating them before they become an abuser, or just have some sort of services and recognizing before they become an abuser and prevent that?
Yeah, I think those are great. That's a very real point, right, Lori? That's a very organic sort of belief and feeling that a lot of people have about, and as you mentioned, we do have to spend time educating our jurors sometimes on cases of domestic violence. Common question: how would you expect a victim of domestic violence to respond? How would you expect them to act? Would you expect them to leave immediately? Would you expect them to immediately pick up the phone and call police and report that? Can you understand why they don't do that? Can you understand why they might be afraid to do that? Let's talk about all the reasons why someone can't just simply do that, right? They share children together. They're financially tied to that person.
Right.
Think about all the situations and dynamics where there is a situation where that person, and that's why places like One Safe Place are so critical, because they don't believe they have anywhere else to turn.
Right.
They may have no family in their area. They may have no friends that they could turn to. The only person that they have that they rely upon every single day for financial support, for every type of support, is their abuser. So how easy is it for us to say, well, you could just report that and put them into the criminal justice system?
Right.
So, but you're right. At the end of the day, how can we intervene with the defendants or the perpetrators of this earlier on, so that they too can understand the absolute damage and carnage that this causes generations, right? 1 in 15 kids are exposed to domestic violence. And that's a very scary statistic. 90% of those children that are exposed are eyewitnesses. And I can tell you that, the number of cases that come across my desk where children are present, are in the same room, are witnessing it. And how do you measure the impact that's going to have on their life?
Completely,
right?
completely
agree. How do you measure what that child is going to see as a normal relationship?
Completely agree.
They grow up. So,
I was because all the information comes from Facebook nowadays, of course. But I saw on Facebook there are these sticky posts from a trauma counselor, and it was like what little kids were saying. And like one of the stickies from a 6-year-old kid said, "If I ran away, my parents wouldn't even know. They're too busy fighting to say goodnight anymore."
Jeez.
A 7-year-old said, "I cry myself to sleep at night. I feel so alone. My mom and dad fight all night long." It's like, we have no idea the trauma that these poor kids are taking with them. But the backpack is so heavy with trauma that we have no idea. And then we wonder why we have abuse later on as adults. It's obvious.
Yeah.
It's traumatic on a number of levels. And when you see, as a prosecutor, and you read those reports and you see, the couple's children were there in the house, in the room, it's just heartbreaking, because you don't know, right? You don't know what that's going to mean for that child down the road, and how they're going to learn from that. And the likelihood that, that there has to be some intervention, and someone, maybe a parent's being prosecuted for abusing the other parent, and the dynamics that's going to cause in the home. And so it's just, it's an absolute tragedy. And one, again, I think that, domestic violence, there's no certain area of the county that this impacts more than others, or there's no, one type of, it's like property crimes or car burglaries, where it's like, well, that area has a high rate of car burglaries, and so maybe you can avoid, that situation, or try to stay away from those situations if it might result in property crimes or things like that. But domestic violence covers all spans of on all walks of life, right? Children all across the county, regardless of where they live and how they live and what type of homes they're being raised in, and any of that, are being subjected to this trauma. And I think that's a great description, Lori. It's a backpack of trauma that, we just will never really understand. I can tell you that, when you see an 18 to 19-year-old kid in your jury pool, and they hear the charges of the seriousness of domestic violence, even in a homicide or an attempted murder, or great bodily injuries been caused or something substantial, you can see it on their faces. You can hear it in their voice when they talk about growing up in a house of domestic violence, and how they can't sit on that jury because they can't get that out of, they can't be fair and impartial because they grew up in a household of that. One Safe Place does forensic interviews for our child victims or people that children who may have witnessed crimes. Again, so it's just another great resource and service that we can provide there versus having a parent shuttle their kids from one place to another all over the county. They can really go to one place, get the counseling they need, have their child do a forensic examination, talk about safety planning, get a restraining order, start that process. It's all there in one place. And again, that's step one, is just making sure those services are accessible.
Ben, you're a local hero. No, I'm serious. The work that you do and the work that our DV unit does, it's one of the largest units in the San Diego DA's office. And it's because, unfortunately, we have just a continued increase of domestic violence cases that have to be prosecuted and have to be dealt with. And those wraparound services require a tremendous amount of work and partnership with our community. So thank you so much for all the work that you do in prosecuting these cases.
Well, I appreciate that. And I mean, I think, our office is full of people who, give so much to any prosecutor that's prosecuting any crime in our office or up and down the state, or, they do so because I like to believe that they care. It matters to them. They want to make a difference in their community. This is an area that's obviously been has been the focus of my career, is domestic violence prosecution, because it matters a lot to me. I think it means a lot to me to know and to see how we as prosecutors can make a difference. And also when you see just, again, the magnitude of impact on the community that this has. I'd like to say that during my time in this office, we've seen the number of domestic violence cases decrease, but the reality is that not only here in San Diego, but in every county and everywhere, it's increasing. Domestic violence is increasing in volume and in seriousness and the people exposed to it. So I think, hopefully, and I know that my colleagues, all of us are really dedicated to doing what we can to fight domestic violence and the spread of domestic violence, and hopefully making a difference. And there'll need to be a lot more focus on this in the future from prosecutorial offices and making sure that we're taking this seriously, because the stakes are so high.
Well, thank you for your dedication to this. I mean, your whole career, you're known in the office as domestic violence prosecutor. You're a team leader up here in the Family Protection Division. So we appreciate your dedication to the public. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
But as you know, we always shift gears if necessary and end on a light note. And we play a little game called Crime or Fiction. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. So for listeners out there, this game is called Crime or Fiction. And each episode, we look at the laws on the books where 2 are real, 1 is fake. And I quiz my panel to see if they can guess which one is the fake. The theme, as you might have guessed, is domestic violence, but this is the history of domestic violence laws. Are you both ready?
No.
Lori?
I was reminded by somebody who actually listens to our podcast that my track record is not very good as of late. I was like, oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
That's true. You did win the last episode, but
that's going to make it even worse if I don't get to try Lori and you beat me. That'll make you're just.
Yes, that would just look bad on you, Ben.
Yes, exactly. Right. Okay, no so pressure. Here we go. In 1899, California was the first state to criminalize domestic violence. B, in 1871, the Alabama Supreme Court was the first in the nation to rescind the legal right of men to beat their wives. And C, in 1911, the first family court in the nation was established in Buffalo, New York. 2 are real, 1 is fake, and see if you could guess which one is the fake. Ben, since you are our resident expert, I'll ask you to go first.
Not really sure what was going on in the late 1800s. I should be more up on that and our advancements of domestic violence law in the country. But I'm going to have to go with B is although I think it's a red herring, but I think B is the fake one.
B, the 1871 Alabama Supreme Court, first in the nation to rescind the legal right of men to beat their wives.
It was a tough call, but I'm going to go with. I'm going to go with the Alabama Supreme Court rescinding the legal right to commit domestic violence is the fake one.
Okay. Do you think it happened before or after that? Just kidding.
Well, after.
That's a trick question. That's a trick question, Jorge.
Yeah.
Lori, how about you?
That's what our kids say. You're don't give us your lawyer questions, Dad. I obviously agree with Ben, and I thought you were going to start with me, but had you started with me, I also would have said B.
Really?
Because I just don't believe Alabama would be the first in the nation to do that.
All right. So both of you agree B. So let's go backwards. Let's go with C. In 1911, the first family court in the nation was established in Buffalo, New York. You both think this is real, and this one is real. I looked it up. I was trying to find, actually, I found it on the California court website. They had some statistics there. I couldn't independently verify it, but I trust our California court website for that fact. And I saw it on multiple trainings. So good on you, Buffalo, New York, to establish that early in 1911. Let's go to B. In 1871, the Alabama Supreme Court was the first in the nation to rescind the legal right of men to beat their wives. You both think this one is a fake, and this one is real.
Oh,
Fulgham versus the state, 1871, the Supreme Court ruled the wife is not to be considered as a husband's slave, and the privilege, ancient though it be, to beat her with a stick, to pull her hair, choke her, spit in her face, and kick her about the floor, or to inflict upon her like indignities is not now acknowledged by our law. So they were the first in the state.
That's
pretty
amazing.
Surprising, right? For
it's
1871.
Amazing that we had to say that in the first place.
Yes.
I can't believe that is written out, that was the norm.
Wow.
to do that. But fortunately, we've come a long way here. So that means 1899, California was the first state to criminalize domestic violence. That is the fake. It was actually Maryland in 1882. They passed a law that says anyone who shall brutally assault or beat his wife shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor.
Ben, how could you not know that?
No, that's what I said. I need to hone up on my late 1800s law. So.
Yes, exactly.
That's the takeaway from this podcast today.
Immediately after I end this podcast, I'm going to start digging into late 1800s changes in the law.
And do you know what the sentence was for Maryland in the 1800s for domestic violence? I'll tell you. It was to be whipped, not exceeding 40 lashes, or in prison for a year for a misdemeanor. So wow. We've also come a long way with that. So thank you both. I'm sorry, Lori, your streak.
It's ended. It's just officially gone. It's okay.
That's right.
I trusted you, Ben. That was the last time.
Our answers were tied together, so neither one of us lose.
Yes, exactly. There you go.
There's no winner.
Well, thank you both again. Thank you, Ben, for joining the podcast again. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month every year, so we wanted to shed light on this very important issue. If you know someone or you're experiencing domestic violence, there's a variety of resources out there. I'll put some in the show notes. There's a 1-800-799-7233 is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you are in San Diego, obviously stop by at One Safe Place. It's in North County for those services that Ben mentioned.
Yeah, and there's also the Family Justice Center downtown for anyone that's listening as well, which it's a similar sort of framework with a lot of different services available. So thank you both for, again, bringing attention to this important issue. And just, I think that the takeaway, if people can begin to appreciate how many people are impacted by this and how difficult of an issue this is for the victims, the surviving, they're going through this, and how critical it is to help them get in touch with someone that can get them some service. So if you know, or like just as you said, Jorge, if you know someone, or you have someone you believe that's going through this experience or is in that cycle of violence or being a victim of domestic violence, please try to do what you can to get them some help, because that early intervention is so critical to preventing some serious violence down the road, or the absolute worst case, which is domestic violence homicide, which is what we're all aiming to hopefully eradicate someday.
Thank you so much, Ben. Appreciate that. Lori, thank you as well, as always.
Thanks, Jorge.
And thank you to everyone out there listening. You could find us on our Facebook page we're San Diego DDAs. You can find us on Twitter as well. We have a dedicated podcast Twitter. It's at Crime News Insider. And you can email us at crimenewsinsider@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, just please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. Spotify now has a rating, and go ahead and give us a 4 or 5 stars. Don't smash the like button. Just softly press the like button. We don't want to get sued for damage to your phone there. But until next time, this is the Crime News Insider Podcast. Expressed on this podcast are solely of the speakers and do not reflect the views of the Deputy DA Association nor the District Attorney. Questions and comments can be sent to crimenewsinsider@gmail.com. Please leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this show. Remember to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @San Diego DDAs. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.